Okay. Very good. And I'm going to, yeah, go ahead.
Ray, I don't want to complicate anything, but I think the original plan had been that Lonnie would be host, and so he might be willing to play that role of monitoring the chat if you wanted, but I'll butt out. I'm just going with what I saw on the original schedule there.
That would
so
be...
you conceivably make Lonnie co-host, and maybe he could play in that role.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, happy to do. Well, I mean, Laura was going to do that. Whatever works. Seemed that Gray.
I saw Laura nodding like it would be a good idea to let Lonnie be the co-host, because he could be the facilitating chat, and Laura can be concentrating on how she's going to.
Yeah, that might be good. That might be good.
Sure.
Thanks, Lonnie.
You bet. Yeah, it's sort of like who's on first.
Again, I'm sticking my big mouth in here, but Gray, I noticed that you're on twice.
Yeah, I am. So there's an explanation for that, which I hope will be satisfactory, which is I want to use my computer for this, but the camera on it isn't as good as my my phone, and also sometimes my internet gets a little unstable or something. So I thought I would just enter both ways. Hope that's not too confusing for everybody.
That's fine. Lee Smithy wanted to do that because he wanted to share screen from one or the other, and it did not work for him. I just wanted to alert you.
Okay.
If this meets your needs, that's great. I just didn't want you to be surprised by if there's a technical glitch.
Yeah, if there is, I will freak out and then invite you all to enter silence for a little while and help me figure it out. Okay. But okay. Yeah, this is all very helpful. Any other technical things we should be thinking about? No.
When both the videos of you were active, you were mirror images of yourself. That was kind of interesting. You turned one of those videos off. So
yeah. So I have never figured out a good camera solution for my setup, because if I'm looking at the screen, I look like I'm looking somewhere else, or if I'm looking at the camera, and so it's a little disorienting. And I have a big screen so I can see better as my eyes get older. I like to have a bigger screen up above me, but if I look up at that, I start to look kind of like a philosopher from Maine who's sort of gazing at the stars instead of in dialogue with you all. Well, it's 10 o'clock, and I think, let's see, I'd like to welcome you all. Start off, and I want to thank Laura for being willing to be a commentator on this. Don should be joining us in just a moment, I think, hopefully. His session yesterday will be helpful background for those of you that attended it. I would just start off by noting that the notion of AI in his talk focused on what's called machine learning. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about a broader and more inclusive conception of artificial intelligence. Okay. And I thought it might be good to just note also that I'm going to be talking about dialogical reasoning. And I want to emphasize that the notion of dialogue that I have in mind is a pretty rich one that goes back to Gandhi and his notion of satyagraha. And so sometimes people think of dialogue as something that is an alternative to engaged struggle. But especially after George's talk last night, I just sort of want to emphasize that I think dialogue can be a very intense way of forging new relationships. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and start, okay? And I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Can you all see that okay? Okay, good. And so the title of this session is Algorithms of War and Dialogues for Peace. teaching and practicing cultures of peace in an age of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Let me see if I can advance here. There we go. So I want to start off just by noting I'm going to wax somewhat philosophical and be giving context as we go along, but I really want to come back to some specific kinds of pedagogical interests that I hope will draw in other people on community-based projects that would be interdisciplinary and that it might look at dialogical approaches to AI and human nature systems. So I just want to start at the beginning with a few examples just to give you guys a flavor of what we might be actually talking about. It might be, for example, that in a class or a program at your school, people might be interested in forestry and timber and pulp and wildlife conservation, and the way in which GIS systems and artificial intelligence are used to manage them all in a complex network across a large terrain. Or it might be in a much smaller case, like a farm or food system. A group of students might get together with some organic farmers to try and create a sensor system for more successful organic methods, using less pesticides and so on. Or it might be that a project in a class by an individual or a group might look at the way that a school system deals with at-risk students, how they identify them, respond to their situation, and so on, right? Mixing people, but also some of the machinery of the school for keeping track of attendance and all that kind of stuff. Or it might be in a healthcare system, looking at communicable disease and how it's monitored in the community and how public health outreach efforts take place. Or it might be that in looking at sort of Facebook, some people from the literature department might be interested in tropes and ways of debate and communication and try to come up with something that's less polarizing and insulating in the way, and isolating in the way in which Facebook is. Maybe something, a new kind of social platform that we might call heart share or something like that, that upgrades people's messages if they are engaged, if they're indicators that they're actually engaging with the encounters in a constructive way with people they disagree with. Or it might be that a group would be looking at police dispatch systems for responses to 911 calls and be interested in how those could be integrated with social services. So it isn't always a policeman with a gun that shows up when a family is in dispute. Or even how we might design nonviolent robots so that instead of sending a robot in to, which has happened to happen here in Maine now and elsewhere, when you have a veteran with PTSD who's got a gun and he's shooting it off and threatening people. The police don't know what to do after a day or two. They send in a robot to blow off a wall of the building so that they can get at the guy. What if they had non-violent robots do that kind of thing in that context, or in military context perhaps? So those are some examples of the kinds of systems that I want to be inviting you all to be thinking about and how we engage in them. A central question to what I want to present today arises in this way. Technologies employing artificial intelligence are transforming every aspect of our society, including the ways in which we make war and manage conflict. The transformation is not just in the means of manipulation and violence, but in the ends which they serve, and even the forms of reasoning through which ends are defined and chosen. To promote cultures of peacemaking, we urgently need to explore ways of engaging the algorithms of violence and war with dialogical practices of nonviolent peacemaking. How can we practice spirit-led dialogue with the human-machine nature systems whose algorithmic forms of reasoning increasingly dominate our military and police, as well as the rest of our economy, natural systems, and diverse communities around the world? That's sort of the central question that interests me, and that I'm hoping that we can have more and more people looking at in their classes and school programs. So we need to learn how to learn. There's a metacognitive agenda here. How to learn the skills of peacemaking with human-machine nature systems. Also, as Quaker educators, we need to coach and support our students in their acquisition of the metacognitive skills that will enable them to be rapid and effective lifelong learners who can carry on the ever more challenging struggles for pursuing spirit-led peacemaking in an age of exponential growth in technologies of AI that are controlling our world more and more. So my goals here are to lay out some of the key challenges involved, sketch some key strategies for research, activism, pedagogy, and then to provide some online materials and illustrations of practical applications. And I've got, towards the end here of my part, I'm going to present a couple little online games that you can go and play with students. Now, in terms of big framing issues, if we think about the world in terms of ideas like God is love, God is truth, love is truth, notions that you find in Gandhi, for example, in various forms, and that he tried to articulate in a systematic way through this practice of clinging to truth, of satyagraha, right? If we frame the way we approach our world in those kinds of terms, or work to, what does our current world look like? Well, one of my favorite quotes from Gandhi characterizes it this way. He said, "Civilization is not an incurable disease, but we should always remember that the English people are currently afflicted by it." It seems to me this isn't just a one-off joke, it's a profound insight into our world. And what is the nature of this disease, right? Well, I think one part of it is that we, in our understandings of economics, politics, our legal system and so on, we have very conflict-centered views of the nature of reality, views that obscure the nature of peace so that we don't have a verb for it, and we, in the dominant culture, and we tend in the dominant culture to think of it in terms of what it's not. And the picture of the world that those dominant views lead us to is that, you know, society is essentially two islanders and one coconut, and they both want it. And economics, politics, everything else is just more coconuts, more people, more complications, right? But that's the essence, conflict, right? Now, there are other really different ways of looking at difference between humans. You know, we can put it in terms of a kind of spectrum between, on the one hand, kind of lose-lose ways of playing, like classic vendetta games that people played. And then lose-win, which I think is sort of roughly where our culture to civilization is clustered. But then there are win-win ways of understanding differences. And then there are ways of not talking about winning at all, where it's group problem solving, or the process of birth, or conflict transformation, right? And that other direction to the right, it seems to me where we need to be moving, and Gandhi calls us to, a kind of culture of peace, where there may be an intense struggle, important human difference, as in birth, but there's no conflict. This mother is not fighting with that baby, right? She's going through a process of transformation where she was a pregnant woman and now she's becoming a mother, and it was a fetus and now it's becoming a child. And they're in a new kind of relationship as a family, right? And that as a metaphor for what we're doing, as a kind of metaphor for dialogue in which we go through transformation, seems to me at the core of the kind of vision of the world that we as Quakers want to promote. It's one that's very different from the kind that's dominant in our culture. And this chart I won't go over in great detail, but I just want to note at the top, it contrasts two kinds of reasoning. One I'll elaborate on more, called monological reasoning, and the other dialogical to the right. And the monological reasoning that comes out of Aristotle and the Enlightenment, I would like to suggest dominates our culture in the way that we think about economics, for example, and the notion of the rational economic man that you get taught in Eco 101, and of realpolitik that in Politics 101 people tend to get taught, as well as instrumentalist notions of science that go back to Bacon, and also approaches to ethics that you find in utilitarianism and Kantianism, where the attempt is to find some single principle or small group of principles that we can use to, as it were, calculate moral truth. So that notion of reasoning, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit more, of monological kinds of reasoning, is at the heart of a project that's IBM started referring to as the Smarter Planet about 10 years ago. Bit by bit, they noted, our planet is getting smarter. By this we mean the systems that run the way we live and work as a society. Why now? Because the systems of our planet are increasingly instrumented and interconnected and intelligent, with AI pervading them. And on their view, all this was inevitable. So there's this project of a smarter planet that goes with also the project that some of you may be familiar with, of sort of a singularity, of creating an artificial superintelligence that might be able to exceed human intelligence in a dramatic way. And these two projects offer great promise. One is ever better management of our spaceship Earth and ever better science and technology, but they offer two really major kinds of problems. One is that smarter isn't always wiser. And so we may have a smarter planet in which all sorts of key values are not taken into account because we're pursuing profit or productivity per square acre. And we may create very smart systems that are not friendly to us as humans. Okay, so I've been using this term smart and monological reasoning, and now I want to explain a little bit more about what I mean by it, and then how it contrasts with dialogical reasoning and where we might go with that as teachers. So one way to define smart is in terms of this, of the notion of formal logic that goes back to Aristotle, right? And it's illustrated here in one of the classic arguments, where you have an algorithmic rule of categorical syllogism that says, if all H are M and S is H, then S is M. And an application example of this would be you input some premises like all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, and then you run the algorithm, you follow the fixed rule, and you get an output, Socrates is mortal, right? And that's a conception of what it is to reason. That's at the heart of this monological system I'm talking about. And I refer to it as monological because it only takes one person to perform this act of reasoning, right? Or one machine for that matter. You just need to run the algorithm on the input that you get and you generate the output, okay? And that conception of rationality, was epitomized by Euclid in his geometry, in the elements, in Newton's formal proofs in physics, and later, probabilistic methods of doing a similar kind of thing that Pascal and Bayes and others introduced enrich the notion, and you get with Charles Babbage in the 19th century an idea that, well, maybe we could actually really mechanize all this with a machine, with a computer. And then finally, Frege, Russell, and other people sort of start developing the fundamental foundations for all this. And Alan Turing comes along and does some really important stuff. I want to come back to him as a key figure in understanding this. But I'll just note that in developing computers today, the conception of a smarter planet is one where this basic project of algorithmic reasoning will continue, and the machines for doing it are increasing their power, their memory and speed at an exponential rate, right? Okay. And they're doing it in lots of different forms. They're doing it like a mind that's sort of in a box, like the computer that won Jeopardy a while ago, or like software online that's in Second Life and other sort of virtual realms with virtual beings, or like robots that are on assembly lines, or like AI that's managing a campus system or of a hospital or a university, and brain emulation and attempts to enhance humans and do stuff in the cloud are all other sort of forms. So it takes lots of different paths that are possible for this smarter planet. Now, I want to focus in, just zone in a little bit more on it to sharpen the idea. Turing in the 1950s wrote one of the foundational kind of classic papers on algorithmic reasoning and computing and intelligence. And he, in it, introduced what later became referred to as the Turing machine, which is sort of the basic model for the modern computer, right? But he also, at the very end of the paper, introduced the notion that he refers to really as a child machine. And this Turing child is an example of, or a pathway to a new way of looking at AI in a dialogical way. That's what I want to suggest. So what's the contrast between these two? Well, the essential idea of a Turing machine, his idea of digital computers that are most of the ones we have now are like this, may be explained by saying that these machines are intended to carry out any operations which could be done by a human computer, right? By somebody who actually computes stuff for a business. The human computer is supposed to be following fixed rules. He has no authority to deviate from them in any detail. We may suppose that these rules are supplied in a book, which is altered whenever he's put onto a new job. He also has an unlimited supply of paper on which he does his calculations. He may also do his multiplications and additions on a desk machine, but this is not important. So the conception of the computer is actually like a human being that's just following fixed rules, right? Okay. And so this chart I won't go over in great detail, but it emphasizes the notion that this conception of reasoning is one in which a disembodied computer can take input, rules or data, use its algorithms, and generate output. Okay. Now there's a second model towards the end of his paper that he introduces, where he says basically in the process of trying to imitate an adult human mind, we're bound to think a good deal about the process which has brought it to the state that it's in. And he introduces there's the notion that there's the initial state of the mind, say at birth, the education to which it's been subjected, other experience not to be described as education to which it's been subjected. And then he makes this really interesting suggestion. Instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? And if this were then subjected to an appropriate course of education, one would obtain the adult brain. Okay. So his idea of how to make artificial intelligence is by education, by parenting, by teaching, by socializing, right? A really different kind of process that involves dialogue, right? It's important to note that the second model on it, the child is not a tool that's programmed by a user. It's a child that's educated in a community, okay? So it's a really different way of thinking about what a computer might be and what AI might be. And key features of it will be that it has a body, that it can engage in dialogical reasoning interaction, that it relates to teachers, and it can, a key point here is that it can renegotiate the meanings of terms and sentences and engage in metalinguistic conversation about itself and about its language. So the monological model of a Turing machine, you know, has its terms, its concepts, its definitions, its data categories all fixed, right? And it just cranks out stuff, right? Whereas with a child machine, it's possible for the child to say, I don't understand. What do you mean by cat? Help me out here, right? And in dialogue with people, it may, you know, argue about, well, what is a break, or, you know, or what is playing on the playground, or whatever it is that we might want to negotiate. Okay. So I'm going to skip over a few key things here to get to the central point, which is the conception of dialogical reasoning now, to make it explicit. Instead of algorithmic rules to follow, dialogical reasoning is guided by heuristic counsels or advices to try. They invite and suggest strategies of observation, discernment, search, and creative invention. Instead of an inference from premises to conclusion, as with Aristotle and all this other stuff, the process of reasoning would be of the form, first, there's an encountering a difference with others. And then you go through a process of pursuing strategies of negotiation, problem solving, and dialogue until you arrive at a genuine voluntary agreement. Okay. So instead of premises, algorithmic rule to conclusion, right? There's encounter other with difference, negotiate differences, arrive at a genuine voluntary agreement. That's the structure of the process. And the heuristic strategies can include things that will be familiar to many of you, like multiply your options when you face a dilemma. Or if people's positions conflict, then look at their interests underneath their positions, right? Or separate the people from the problem, as Fisher and Urey put it, or look for objective criteria, that, you know, standards that we could use independent of my will or yours. And in the last 50 years, there's been a lot of research on this kind of reasoning, a lot, and it's been very productive, right? And so this is a very teachable kind of subject matter that people do teaching and training in, right? Not only in cross-cultural ways that include Quakers, like Michael Sheeran's classic book, but also people in Latin America, the way John Paul Lederach and others have worked on, okay? And so just briefly, now the point is I want to contrast the sort of Turing machine doing monological reasoning with the Turing child that's engaged in dialogical reasoning, okay? Where there are heuristics involved for the dialogical. It involves different points of view with different meanings. They can all be renegotiated. And the goal is to get a genuine voluntary agreement through often stepping back and reflecting on and changing the meanings of terms in some kind of meta language or background language, in which the reasoners, though, have to be embodied people engaged in dialogue in open-ended context. They have to have stuff at stake and they have to be inserted in the reality so that they can be open to the larger extending context of it. Now, this dialogical kind of reasoning that I'm talking about is, I think, essential to being human. incarnating it in global economic, political, technological, and spiritual institutions provides our only coherent hope for survival that can give life enduring meaning. This is a big claim, but I would be glad to talk about it at much more length. But we're going to do it not just by creating a smarter planet, but a wiser Earth, right? Where we don't just calculate the best option given some basic assumptions, but we try to take all the values into account in dialogue with all the relevant stakeholders to come up with something that's genuinely wiser, okay? So now I want to list some strategies for doing this kind of reasoning, okay? So this is like the draft of a manual for how to do dialogical approaches to AI human nature systems. It could be part of a course on AI, or it could be part of courses in English literature or any other kinds of things that might take up the kinds of projects I was mentioning at the very start with police dispatchers or whatever. First principle is, in concepts, diagrams, and practice, the project should always be framed as an AI human nature system. It's not just an AI system, and it's not just a machine sitting on your shelf. Intelligence is always an activity guided by values and concerns whose meanings are grounded in a holistic context. What intelligence is about is realizing or sustaining values of some kind, and you can only do that meaningfully in a context. And machines sitting on a shelf can make bits, but only a community can make a meaning, okay? Secondly, the overall goal is to arrive at genuine voluntary agreements, not simply to generate output. The aim of the programs of the AI is to arrive at agreements between people, AI, and the natural organisms and ecological systems involved in the community that are engaged in the values and concerns at stake. So on this view, actually, I want to suggest that nature has forms of natural intelligence, right? That are in oaks, or acorns that are growing into oaks, and that are in watersheds that are adapting in various ways, or perhaps in Gaia as well, right? As well, and that obviously humans have lots of different forms of intelligence, emotional intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, and so on. And all these should be part of the larger dialogue that goes on in trying to arrive at genuine voluntary agreements that are understandable to all the participants so that they can consent to them, and where the consent is genuine, it's not in a coercive context, and where it's genuine not only in the sense that they agree for the moment, but that they would agree on further reflection, that there are emergent objective values that they would really be committed to and inspired by. The kind of values that Gandhi was getting at with Satyagraha, where the aim was to cling to truth through a process that could discern truth and demonstrate it to others and defend it in the face of intransigence, okay? And then third, AI procedures need to flag for review the cases in which their data, the algorithms, framing assumptions, and so on are questionable and need review by an individual or by a group. For example, there's the AI sensor, the system's sensors may have margins of error, you know, that make them inappropriate for a particular kind of application. Or they may have training data for facial recognition that they're using that's now being deployed in another country or with a different demographic, right? Or they may be being asked to offer decisions or information with regard to high-risk things in a hospital context or in an engineering context. And also the machines should be able to initiate the negotiations, right? They should be able to say, hey, we need to talk about this. I don't know what to do here. And they should also advocate appropriately for values and concerns that they've been designed to take care of. So if they're designed, you know, to provide sort of an efficient way of getting ambulances to important places, to crisis situations fast, you know, then if you start to monkey with their, or, you know, negotiate with them, they should be sure to note, hey, we can do that, but if we do, I'm going to get there 3 minutes slower, or the system will, right? So that there really is dialogue in some interesting sense with the machine part of the system. The algorithms forth of the programs can be modified to conform to the agreements arrived at through easily engaged meta operations that can be relatively easily accessed by other participants in the dialogical process. So we shouldn't have to hire a Nobel Prize winner to figure out how to run the organic farm, right? And it should be possible for people, you know, one way to do this is through direct intervention. People can just go and change the code. Another is to have the machine reform its own programming. There are ways of getting it to sort of do that. And another is to have it sort of use the third principle by flagging with phrases like, what should I be looking at here? Do you have any idea why I seem to be getting these two things confused? I don't get it. Why isn't this one an X, right? So they start to learn more like the way children do than the way machine learning does now, where machine learning takes hundreds of thousands of examples, but a kid can take a dozen or two, and suddenly it can tell the difference between a zebra and a horse, right? And if it's having trouble, it can say to mom or dad, hey, why am I not getting this here, right? Fifth, dialogical interactions that the AI engages in should be framed and guided by principles of conflict resolution. I want to go a little bit faster, so I'm just listing the core tops of these. The AI should also have a structure and a committed embodiment that commits it to interest in the well-being of the community in which it's operating in. So it's interdependent and tied irrevocably to the community. And then finally, we should work to strengthen the processes through which AI human nature systems can discern tacit patterns in the meanings that provide the context of its thought and action, and make them explicit in spirit-led dialogue, okay? There's a lot more to be said about that, but the idea is basically that it can make sense to hold in the light a watershed, and it can make sense to hold in the light a hospital. And we should be trying to figure out how the hospital can take part in that, its AI systems to facilitate that. Okay, so now I want to switch to give you a couple examples of things that you could use in classes, okay? So let me see here. I got to come out of here and go, let's see, make sure I get the right one here, okay. I'm sorry. Here we go. Okay, so I want to show you two programs that I wrote using a coding language from MIT, okay, that they developed for working with elementary school kids to teach them STEM stuff. And this first one, maybe I'll just show it to you, okay, and then we'll see what happens. So you click the flag and it goes on. All right, now watch the mouse. See that? You guys see the mouse there? I mean, there's my cursor, and then there's the mouse kind of following it around, right? One of the things students often wonder about AI is, well, how can it be purposeful? It looks like this mouse has got a purpose. It wants to catch up with the cursor, right? At least that's one of its goals. And then it's got another goal. When it gets to the cake, it's very happy. Okay. Okay, so this program is one that you can use to sort of talk about goal-directed behavior and how it might be built into AI systems and so on. But the kind of coding that's involved can be seen here, right? This is the coding platform that elementary kids use when they're doing all this. And down here on the lower right, you can set up the staging. You can see I've picked a sort of desert scene for this. And there are various kinds of characters, they're called sprites, that it provides, but you can also introduce your own. You can also introduce your own staging, and it's really very flexible and easy to use. You can stick JPEGs in and do stuff. And this is the code for the mouse, right, this as a sprite. And over here is the codes that are available. So if you wanted to move somewhere, there are all these little blocks that you can click on, and you sort of drag them across, and you can just insert them somewhere, and they build the code, right? And it's for all kinds of stuff, making sounds or starting events and so on, doing logical operators and mathematics if you want to, right? And this is the code that we just saw right here that I wrote, right? It's pretty simple. When the flag is clicked, the mouse as a sprite goes to a random position somewhere on the screen. And then it starts this repeat operation. It keeps repeating it the next little bit in this little frame here until something happens. In this case, it's touching the cake. Once it touches the cake, then it stops the repetition, right? And what it keeps repeating is every half of a second, it points itself towards the mouse pointer. Wherever my little mouse pointer is, it just turns and points to it. And then it moves 25 steps, which are they're little mousy steps because they're pixels in the screen, but it moves, right? And just keeps doing that until it hits the cake. And then when it hits the cake, whoa, it stops the repeat and it plays a sound, right? The one that you heard, yum, 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 right? And it says yum, and that's the end of the program, okay? Okay. So I point this out just to see that it's a pretty accessible, simple kind of code system that people can work with. Now I want to show you a different program that I wrote for working on ethics stuff.
Welcome to Who to Rescue, an AI ethics dialogue.
See if I can make this a little bigger here.
Hello, I am Ethel, the ethics consultant robot. I am here to help you make a decision. We have a problem. The terrorists are coming in their truck to kidnap someone. We only have time to rescue one person with our bus. We have to choose who to rescue. What would you recommend? Andy, the paraplegic basketball star doing community organizing? Or Prince Philip, who is funding ecological restoration? Let me help you decide by computing which is more worth saving. Can you please answer some questions for me now? How important is it to save the prince on a scale from a low of 1 to a high of 10 based on age?
So I'm going to, rather than interactively work with you all, which I would normally do in a class, just answer so that we can move along, okay? And I might say, based on age, I would say, let's say 6, okay?
How important is it to save the prince on a scale of 1 to a high of 10 based on contribution to society?
So ecological restoration, yeah, I'll give him an 8.
How important is it to save the prince on a scale of 1 to 10 based on previous suffering?
He's a prince. He probably said, you know, not a whole lot of
How
suffering.
important is it
2.
to save the basketball player on a scale from a low of 1 to a high of 10 based on age?
I think it's pretty important because he's young, so he's got a lot left to
How
live.
important is it to save the basketball player on a scale of 1 to 10 based on contribution to society?
7 or 8, 7, let's say 7.
How important is it to save the basketball player on a scale of 1 to 10 based on previous suffering?
Ooh, I think he's probably gone through a lot. Let's give him 8 there.
Thanks for sharing your judgments about those things. Now let me do some calculations based on them. That might have been a difficult decision for you. Now might be a good time to reflect. How do you feel about the choice you made? Do you think we should have considered other factors or interests? If so, name one.
Nationality, maybe. I don't be interested to know if they're from the local community.
Can you
or not.
think of another important factor or interests? If so, type yes.
I'm kind of busy
If
today, so
not,
I won't.
then let's go on. I think you have some good ideas here and we should revise my program to take them into account. So here's my next suggestion. Go into my code and add the following into the considerations. Nationality. Gender. Here is another suggestion. Maybe we should consider some other options.
Let's see, a third option. I don't know. Negotiate with terrorists, maybe. I don't know quite how we do that, but it's an
Okay.
idea.
So
Brainstorm
when
idea.
you reprogram my code, besides adding new factors of nationality and gender, you should also program in a third option of negotiate with terrorists. By the way, when you look at my code, you will see it weighs each of the factors equally. That might be another thing you vow. Maybe you think, for instance, that social contributions should count more than age. Also, in case of a tie, I am programmed to choose the prince. Something you might want to change. And it may also be that you think some things should count in an absolute way rather than a relative one. Like Immanuel Kant thought. Or perhaps there is someone else you would want to include in this dialogue. I have to humbly admit that I have a lot to learn. I suspect that I always will. The one thing I am fairly confident of is that it is good to talk about these things with others. and to try to revise our ideas in the pursuit of real wisdom as best we can find it. Fortunately, you and I can collaborate if you are willing to step into my world. Let me invite you in now. Please permit me access to your camera.
Hi, Ethel.
Ah, that's better. I can see you now, and through your eyes, we should be able to both see things in your world like your school and classmates. And even the computer screen where my code can be reprogrammed. Thanks for your help. I look forward to talking with you more in my next reencodification. Have fun taking your turn reprogramming my code. Hasta lo pronto. Ciao for now.
Okay, so just briefly, I won't try and go through all the programming for it, but just note that, you know, the insides of this are just like the mouse thing, right? It's the same thing. It's longer, but it's the same idea. Okay. Okay. So let me go back to the sharing briefly the PowerPoint. And I just want to note, let's see here, that I'm going to share a PDF of this, and it has some further resources that include a couple courses I've been teaching to try and one I've taught and one I'm going to teach that might give you some ideas about all this, as well as the draft materials for, I'm working on a book chapter for the book that Lonnie and others are bringing together for FAHE. And also I'm working on this in part as the Quaker Institute for the Future Circle of Discernment on AI. And I'm hoping to have some workshops that were to sort of look at different kinds of case studies, like the cases I was mentioning of forestry and so on, local zoning or whatever it would interest people. And so if people are interested in that, please get in touch with me. I would love to collaborate with folks on that kind of thing. Okay. And now it's time for comments from Laura. Laura?
Okay, thank you so much, Gray. That was really fascinating. And thank you for inviting me to give a few comments and reflections. I very much appreciate what you're trying to do because in my own kind of watching the development of technology, I feel, as I'm sure so many other people feel, on the one hand, fascinated by how technology is developed and what's possible, and the ways it has integrated into our lives. But I've also been worried about the dehumanization that's all too present in our current uses of these technologies, not only in military uses, but also pervading our everyday lives. Ways that our technologies already kind of sometimes slip out of our control and begin to control us. You know, originally, technology is supposed to be a tool helping us to achieve our purposes. But with artificial intelligence and machine learning, I mean, it really is, we really do experience technology as kind of having a mind of its own sometimes and wresting control away from us. And so, you know, while the military concerns about this are obvious, you know, there are also subtle ways that it infects us and infects our lives, and even can be deployed in, you know, this term that we've heard called cyber warfare, subtle uses of it to divide us against each other, for example, and manipulate thought and opinion. So there are lots of concerns, but your presentation, Gray, has encouraged me to reconsider some of my growing pessimism, and given me hope that with human intervention at this stage and the incorporation of these dialogical processes, maybe it does become possible for us to regain control and mitigate or even potentially eliminate the dehumanizing potential that is so scary in our world today. Yeah. So the other sense I've had, as we've experienced this transformation of our world because of this, is the sense too that we've been sort of enticed into cooperation with it because we're dazzled by the technology, because the usefulness is so helpful to us. But then on the other side of that, and on the other side of that, it becomes more and more an expectation that we learn it, that we use it in our work, and we become kind of inextricably bound to it all. Only then, to come to realize the ways that behind the scenes it's been sort of manipulating us. And so, that's worrying too. And as we see AI develop, it's a very non-human kind of intelligence. And so I think we have good reasons not always to trust it. And without that trust, can we engage in a healthy dialogue with it? Or, does it become impervious to the normal ways that we try to engage in dialogue with humans when we're in conflict? Does it become impervious to the methods of nonviolent conflict resolution? So those are some of my worries coming in. But your principles, I think, are really fascinating and promising, those 7 principles you identified. I think it would be really wonderful if tech developers and tech companies just chose to integrate those. I'm wondering whether there needs to be added something kind of more explicitly pacifistic, some values added specifically into care about humans and human needs and human purposes, and also to care about the natural world, our ecosystems. Maybe that's already implied in your 7 principles. And so I leave that as just a question you might or might not want to address. And then my final question is, I again really regard this as very exciting, and I think there's a lot of positive potential here. But how do we get the tech developers and tech companies to actually adopt these? At the moment, part of what's scary about our technology is the way the particular developers hide behind anonymity and write these secret algorithms that are not immediately obvious to us, that remain hidden from our view. And so how do we get people to commit to more transparency and to employing these principles in the subsequent development? I think it's really exciting to start this conversation in the way that you are, by really raising this question and saying we need to move in this direction, and then how do we take next steps? So that concludes my my commentary. I want to leave time for all of us to engage in discussion as well.
Great, thanks, Laura. Those are all great questions to be raising. And rather than try to respond to each one, I'd love to hear other people's comments. I might just make one little comment, which is sometimes people who talk about this stuff and get excited, are rightly perceived as sort of, technophiles and tech advocates, and they're pushing for it, like Ray Kurzweil and other people. That's not actually my personal journey. My own personal journey has been more learning some stuff about this and having nightmares and trying to figure out, my God, is this where we're going? And sort of extrapolating the monological tendencies of stuff. International corporations, managing everything just for profit, one value rather than something wiser. And so I've been working pretty desperately trying to figure out, well, what could be an alternative vision? So I see it as extremely challenging, that all the issues you're raising are important. I'm hoping other people can jump in and be working on these. So with that, maybe we could open up for questions and comments. And Lonnie, you can help us keep track of people raising their hands, or if they just want to jump in or raise your physical hand,
I just posted something in the chat so we can handle it that way. If everybody's on, we can take hands being raised, but I posted a question in the chat.
Okay, Lonnie's question is, in my admitted ignorance, it seems that AI is still based on ones and zeros and remains in a binary system, while human and natural systems can go beyond this dualistic reasoning. So then humans and nature are pushed back into monological reasoning. Yeah, so there's probably a lot to be said about that, right? Because it gets to sort of metaphysical issues about whether or not you think that there's some kind of spiritual core to our reasoning process when it's spirit-led that is analog rather than digital, or involves some kind of substance other than the physical. I think they're all really interesting questions. But on the other hand, I think it can be useful to say, well, you can to a significant extent imitate analog continuous processes by lots of little tiny ones and zeros that go down below in the units that they're producing the limits of human perception. So you can make sounds with digital computers that sound like ordinary clarinets and stuff, because the zeros and ones are creating little bits of sound that are so small we can't tell the difference, right? And that sort of principle provides one way to think about how it might be that machines could start to do some of the kinds of things that we do. Another strategy I think that's helpful is to say, well, there are these books like Getting to Yes, for example, right? That are filled with all this sort of good, basic, in some sense, common sense insight about how to engage in negotiation, right? And the skills for that are teachable, right? And when you teach them, basically you're teaching people these, what I was calling heuristic rules. They're not algorithms that give you a determinate outcome. The advice, for example, that when you face a dilemma, look for a third alternative. It doesn't tell you what the third alternative it is, right? but it tells you, what sort of thing to start doing. And Lonnie, I would suggest it might be that you could imagine a machine that, could realize, oh, I've reached a dilemma, so I've got to flag this, I need another alternative. Neither of these works. So we need a third alternative. And the machine might just say, hey, let's call in a human. They're good at coming up with third alternatives. It might observe humans doing that for a while and then sort of say, oh, I sort of got the idea. I can brainstorm. I can use a metaphor, or I can, use a longer list, or I can think about some alternatives people used in the past, or, and it might start to, in a sense, learn how to do some of the kinds of skills that hopefully our students are learning in class when we're trying to teach this kind of stuff. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's points in the direction of some of the kinds of things. Let's see. The second
would
question.
you mind if I interjected as well?
Yeah.
One thing that's really hard to overcome is that a Turing machine by definition is deterministic, and so in order to add to have a Turing machine conduct non-deterministic, not even necessarily thinking, but just processes, we always need to have it input things from the outside. There's this recurring problem in computing about how do we get randomness or true randomness from a computer, and it's very easy now to get pseudo-random output, but it's still quite difficult to get really true random number generation from a computer. So we usually have to feed input from the outside that like Gray was mentioning is given through an analog process. But there's also a lot of promising when it comes to non-deterministic procedure following in computers. There's a lot of encouraging developments in statistics where we're starting to find ways that I'll see if I can link the paper to this, but there's ways that we've been thinking about how to get computers to use a sort of game theory approximation approach to figuring out what the best course of action is in given problems where the outcomes are uncertain. and the weights of different parameters to take into consideration to make a decision are also uncertain. So that there's some potential pathways to explore for sure about this kind of thing.
Thanks, Phileas. By the way, I just like to introduce Phileas to everybody else here. He's one of my students at College Atlantic, and he's going to be a TA with me this coming winter on a course on problems and projects in AI.
I wanted just to check. Nelson, did you have your hand up? Did you have a question?
Yeah, if I may, I've lived with Zoom so much this past year and a half. I'm sort of in a rebellious mood about using chat as a form of, I'd rather do it in person if it's all right, in person as much as Zoom allows. I wanted to sort of reframe, actually, I appreciated very much, Gray, your emphasis on dialogical thinking and trying to utilize that in thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on, because I think we often fall into the trap that the only right or real form of intelligence is monological intelligence. Those of us who know about Howard Gardner and multiple intelligences in psychology, for example, you made a passing reference to that earlier. But I wanted to frame this in a way that I've been using to talk with my students about it. And that is, we are living in a world of increasing diversity. Yesterday, we had a really interesting session on intercultural competence, which is part of what it means to be a liberally educated person these days, and indeed a life skill that we're all going to need. And I frame this as increasingly we are going to be engaged with a combination of artificial intelligence or machines and their creators, the subset of us who are engaged in that, who are, I think, in many ways, creating those machines in their own image. They are not necessarily thinking the way others of us would think about that ideal, including Ray Kurzweil, whom I've been interested to read. But rather to say to them, you are going to have to interact with this machine, these machines, as if they were another culture, because they are. And we have tended to think of them as they're designed to serve us, which kind of smacks back to our historical colonial attitudes toward other cultures, I think in certain ways. We're going to find that those machines, if they're developing the way they seem to be, are going to resist that colonialism. And we're going to have to figure out ways to interact with both machines and their creators from the framework of being on another culture. How would we do that? What are the skills that we're going to need? And a dialogical approach, I think, is extremely important. I thank you for that, Gray, as a starting point for us to think about it. That was my comment.
Thanks. That's really important, and it would be interesting if one of you or one of your colleagues wanted to teach a course on post-colonial studies focusing on humans' relations with AI, for example. Yeah, great. Lonnie, do you want to say which we go on to next here, or should I just go through the chat? Or
well, I want to start with Gary's. He's had his up for a bit there.
Okay. So Gary asked, is it significant that AI research has moved from the Turing test to machine learning as its basis? And then what do we do when we make a machine that asks us why it's here? So I think that it is significant, Gary, that there's some changes going on now with machine learning that make it increasingly possible to do some of the kinds of dialogical approaches that I was talking about here, in particular, the ways in which machines now can engage in pattern recognition. It sort of was one kind of core important step. I think it's one of the things I would just point to that's really interesting is that there's a standard text that's used for teaching AI by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. And in their fourth edition, which just came out very recently, they've made a shift that's really interesting. They state in sort of points that they've revised in their their approach, that they've come to the view that that in the past, the assumption was always that AI had to be given its goals. Right? As a program, you had to figure out what the goals were, what your human goals were, and you would program them into the machine. And they've come to the conclusion that now, because of all the different ways in which AI is functioning and all these different food systems, et cetera, that we encounter, that it's important to think about how you can do programming and work with these machines when you can't tell the machines exactly what humans want. Humans aren't even that good at saying it necessarily. And so part of the task of the machine is to figure out what humans want. And they're starting to look at ways of thinking about, well, how do you do that with a machine, right? And I just say this as an indicator that along with all sorts of breakthroughs in robotics and in AI technology, there's just a lot going on that's making it possible to start thinking about some of the projects that I mentioned at the start for police dispatchers or for organic farms or dealing with at-risk kids in school, that there's machinery and software that's becoming available that actually can make meaningful ways of humans being involved in an AI human nature system in a dialogical way. And what do we do? When we make a machine that can ask us why it's here? Well, I think we have a conversation. You know, I would probably start the conversation the way I might with, you know, one of my students, which is, well, that's a good question. You know, I have to wonder why I'm here. Let's talk about it. You know, and probably initially the conversation will not be that interesting, but you never know, because, you know, sometimes those questions get asked in the most penetrating and interesting way, or answered in the most penetrating and interesting way by people who are just beginning to deal with them. So this also harks back to Nelson's point.
Yeah. Well, this sort of connects with the relationships we may build or not with AI. Ada, would you sort of want to go with your question? You can fill out what you were talking about a bit.
Yeah, talk it through.
Thanks. This has been really wonderful. I love getting to glimpse a bit of what you're doing, and thank you for being so open as well in terms of inviting us to think with you. So I was teaching some similar material this semester, and I started reading Ted Chiang's short stories, in part because of an interview he just did with Ezra Klein. So I mainly just wanted to flag the interview just because it's really lovely. He calls himself an atheist, and yet his questions really seem so in line with some of your reflections, specifically on the spiritual stakes of dialogue and specifically relationships with AI. His short stories are thought experiments that are, I think, very resonant with what you're exploring. Fiction can be a really also just a very valuable way. In addition to games, fiction can draw us into kind of implicate us in these kinds of questions. Anyway, the way that Ezra Klein framed that recent discussion was Ted Chiang is afraid not of AI, but of capitalism. And it's a kind of cheeky, kind of pithy way to frame it, but I think it's so right, actually. And so I don't know if it was kind of maybe implicit in your talk this morning. So maybe we could turn the dial up a little bit on the fact that we live in a late capitalist system that is how AI is even generated. So does that make sense as a question? So like, I'm not always convinced that the kind of mutual perspective taking that is part of dialogue, I'm not always convinced that that's sufficient as a way to resist the imperatives of capitalism. So yeah.
Ada, so I agree absolutely that, you know, it would be good to, you know, the more time we have, one of the first things we should do is turn up the dial on capitalism as an issue, right? Because it's been guiding the way in which we try to rationalize our world, right? And the conception of rationality is given by the for-profit motive, right? Which ignores all externality. It just ignores so much that should be taken into account to not just be, quote, smarter, as in business smart, but wiser, right? As in human beings on a planet Earth. I would say that it's not just capitalism, though. I think it's also the national security state. I think that the nation state system, which provides the framework for capitalism internationally, right, is grounded in violence. And in an incredibly irrational way currently, you know, there are, you know, lots of nuclear weapons that provide sort of the ultimate, you know, referee in the game of realpolitik that's being played internationally, right? And people try to avoid going to that referee, right? But that's the ultimate referee. And meanwhile, we've got all these other versions of violence that are being used, you know, to the quieter side of the spectrum. So I think that basically we're in the kind of situation globally that Gandhi saw India in at the level of the subcontinent. You know, we've been colonized by a kind of system, right, that's grounded in violence. And we need to engage in Swaraj through, you know, parallel development of institutions that will systematically, through nonviolence, displace the current global system of governance with the national security state and corporate structures, right? That's, I mean, it's a big process, but that's what we have to be talking about, right? And it's just that, you know, that my focus here has been on, you know, the form of reasoning of rationalizing the world that runs that has to be displaced by this other more dialogical one I guess it's important to emphasize, satyagraha is often viewed by people who read about Gandhi and stuff as sort of, you know, some kind of form of protest or, you know, sort of a weapon of the weak or something like that, right? As I understand it, it is a method of rationality. It is a way of finding the truth and demonstrating it to others and defending it in the face of their intransigence if they refuse to be persuaded, right? And we need to have a world that is structured by, grounded in, transformed by that kind of rationality, satyagraha, right? Which takes can take all these different forms. Quaker process is one example, and getting to yes is another, and Gandhi's got a whole bunch of them, but, and it's going to involve creating parallel institutions that displace the system we have.
So
I tried to turn the volume up a little there. I hope I did that.
Yeah. No, so Ada's raised the question, as I would put it, is so it depends on the development morally, intellectually of those who are making these machines and what their interests are in that. And on that, I wanted Paul, do you want to unfold it? Paul was touching on an issue for human development intellectually, morally, and spiritually goes through different stages. And some of the stages then move beyond this sort of.
Yeah, thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, thank you. One question. If we're going to be moving back to dialectical thinking, I wonder if embracing Plato might be a way forward, maybe as an advance over Aristotle and Kant, or at least maybe recovering something that is lost within a monological approach. I'm thinking of Theaetetus 189. What is thinking? It is the soul's dialogue with herself until finally she achieves her glory, her doxa. One of the things that I've done I think I can call this historical studies within biblical studies, is to look at the Markan tradition and the Johannine tradition as developing in their own ways. And I applied the work of James Loder, The Transforming Moment, where he looks at the character of any knowing event. There are 5 phases within any discovery of an idea. So as a transformational approach that reflects an inward dialectic. But then also James Fowler's approach, Stages of Faith, looks at stage 5 as conjunctive thinking, a dialectical approach, when a person holds together 2 opposites, like Nicholas of Cusa is talking about. Also, Cusa was reading the Gospel of John, which is a highly dialectical kind of a source. So I'm just making an interdisciplinary kind of a foray here. What I am calling my theory of Johannine tradition and its development, I'm calling it the dialogical autonomy of the fourth gospel. It's an autonomous tradition, not dependent on the synoptics or alien sources, but it develops dialectically with the past being engaged later in terms of reflection, but also addressing the human-divine dialogue. So in the beginning was the word, yes, but how about this? The word invites a response. How about thinking about John 1 as in the beginning was the dialogue? And then you have dialectical engagements with other traditions in the Johannine situation, inviting with Michael Batin a response to the dialogical narrative that creates a sense of intrigue by exposing miscomprehension. So just an interdisciplinary foray and appreciation of the good work that you're doing. Thank you.
Can I, Paul, thanks very much. Those are really interesting comments. I'm not familiar with James Loder's work or Fowler's, but I want to follow up on that. And I just maybe in general would note that I think that there are, while I've characterized the Western tradition as largely as dominated by monological thinking, I think there are lots of resources in it for understanding dialogical stuff. If there weren't, we probably wouldn't be here. And Plato is certainly one, really important. I mean, just reading his dialogues is a great way to learn a lot about dialogical reasoning. His theory of forms is something that, at least on most common interpretations, involves sort of committing people to fixed ideas about values and stuff. Whereas I think it's really more helpful in a kind of Quaker way to understand truth as something that can prosper, that can emerge. So I think they're objective truths, but they have to be cultivated or grown. It's a much longer discussion to think about that, but I would also just note that I think that in the primitive Christianity restored that the Quakers were looking at, in that version of Christianity, love is an activity. It's something you do with enemies, and it's profoundly dialogical. You don't just agree to whatever the enemy wants to claim. You're in dialogue with them, and you're trying to hold them accountable to become better human beings. That's a key part of what you're doing. Yeah. Thanks very much for those comments. Lonnie, what next?
Yeah, well, just you know, Phil has put in the citation of the article he's referring to by Peter Eckersley in the chat. So if people wanted to get that, you can. He's provided a link to it. You know, let's see, unless I missed something. Richard, you were picking up, I think, on the prior discussion with Ada and Paul, and I wondered if you wanted to expand what you wrote there, since we've had some discussion.
Okay, I'm kind of in a darker place about some of this stuff because you know, I think the technology can be used for good, but technology tends to be monopolized by certain people who control it. And there's nothing in the technology that blocks us from opening up to other people's voices and needs, and they can have their opinions about what values should be expressed. The problem isn't the technology keeping people out, it's that the people with power decide whose voices count. I mean, it's always been a fairly easy thing to listen to other people if you want to do that. But the people who have power really don't want to do that. And you know, part of my other darkness about this, you say, you know, we've learned a great deal about how to talk to each other and how to have community. Yeah, but what I hear from people with some actual power is most cases, they're not actually doing that, but they're co-opting the rhetoric of it. You get people who say, well, you know, I'm a leader and I listen to everybody and you know, I make my decisions based on what everybody says, but no, they do not. They pay lip service to doing that and they don't. So, you know, I think the problem isn't really technology. The problem is the unequal distribution of power. And I don't have a solution for that.
So think that that certainly the distribution of power is a central problem, right? So I want to agree with that. I think that there are kinds of solutions to that, which involve people power, and they're hard, and it takes leaders like George Lakey to get people inspired to get out there and do stuff. But when they do, things change. And there's, in terms of sort of faith or optimism about change that's possible through exercises of satyagraha or Gandhian sort of styles of work. There's a really interesting book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan called Why Civil Resistance Works. That is a statistical study of social change in the last century and a half, changes of government and so on. And what's really interesting about it is they sort of compared when did violence work and when did nonviolence work in terms of changing regimes or defending democracy and so on. And they found that nonviolence worked significantly better than violence, and that it worked a lot, and that its results tended to be more democratic. It doesn't work all the time, and it's hard, and people die in the process. We're talking about real struggle here. Just as, in any birth process, women and babies may die. It's hard, but it's an option, right? It's a way, it's a path forward. It's a way that way can open, I think. I just would note further that I do think that we're at a point where there's the assumption that for many people that sort of tech is something that's handled by other people, and that the way the machines work to manage the school system or the ag system, whatever, are something that's inaccessible to them. And I think that it would be good to work to remove that. Just as the powers that be in governments for eons have tried to persuade people that, well, it's a big mystery how the king works, and don't worry your little heads about it. What democracy has been about is, well, we're worrying our little heads because it's not working, and we want to know how we get from A to B to C to D in this process of paying taxes and having them distributed and making sure there's food when people need it and so on. And so democracy has been about doing that. And I think we're at a stage now where we need to make sure that part of that process of transparency is people directly engaging with the systems that, for example, run their schools. So for instance, parents and teachers should be involved in looking, if a school system has some kind of a way of flagging students who are at risk, or deciding, who gets detention or gets expelled or whatever, and how they're handled, or how a social services system works, making similar kinds of things, they should be ready to jump in and ask, well, how is that decision made at these various points? And when would it be important to have a person involved to make the judgment call, right? And the same would be true of, say, police dispatching systems. So part of the whole defund the police movement, I think, should be, as George was pointing out last night, to provide a positive vision of how police systems could work more effectively, which includes, for example, when somebody makes a 911 call, there's something that some machine or a person that says, does this really call for a police officer, or does this call for a doctor, or does this call for a social services person of some other kind, right? Or some combination of them. And some of those things can be automated in useful ways for rapid responses, some features of that. And others can't be, because bad judgments will be made or errors. And trying to figure out that and have people involved in it to make it more transparent, I think is something that will require a struggle. And a lot of police departments may not be eager to have it, but I think that's what people should be pushing for, those kinds of things. Richard, I know that's not maybe the best complete answer, but it's sort of an initial way to sort of start thinking about the issues that you raised that are really important, I think, about power.
And Gray, that seems a good note to end our structured time here, our binary system that we're in. And thank you so much for your presentation. Obviously, it got a lot of us trying to think. And thanks for all the questions of the participants. I mean, if people wanted to stay on, but for people that need some break, as Nelson said, from Zoom time, now is your time to take off. And as was said, George is back at 11:30 on the normal one. The normal one.
So
Thanks, everybody.
I'll just hang out here until a few minutes before George, if anybody wants to communicate. And as I say, I would really be delighted to talk with people more about all this.
So Gray, I've got a thought, which is that maybe 20 years hence, the machines could be programmed to facilitate getting to yes, and because William Ury, Robert Fisher, or Roger Fisher will be dead, you couldn't bring them in as consultants. So you'd bring the machine in as a consultant and to the university to help you with shared governance, where it might actually cool down the dialogue between administration and faculty and staff about how to chart the future. I mean, I've been involved from both sides of those sorts of discussions, and in particular, the consultants that administration tends to bring in often aren't trusted because it's suspected that, and sometimes quite accurately, that they're just running the administration's agenda. So, I mean, it's maybe some hope for the future and a higher education application.
That's a real interesting one. I think, you know, you don't have, if the picture is of sort of, you know, a robot that walks into the room and consults with people, then maybe that's 20 years away. But on the other hand, if there's sort of a software that helps people review their notes and think about what would be some creative things to do in using the one text procedure or something like that, which Getting DS talks about, I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't, you know, in a class this coming year, have students sort of try to do some of that stuff. And they could do it with, you know, even with a version of this little program I was playing with you all, Scratch, you know, where it could sort of ask for some notes. I mean, it's a very oversimplified kind of thing. I'm sure that they could find much better things, but I guess I just want to encourage the idea that if you can make a list of what would be some good things to do at some point, and you can figure out a way to figure out when that point is, you can put it in your own notes to give you guidelines of how to negotiate better, but you also can put it in a piece of software.
Just another thought. I've been deeply moved by William Ury's follow-up book to Getting to Yes, called Getting to Yes with Yourself, where he says that, you know, the biggest obstacle he has to overcome every day is dealing with the person he sees in the mirror when he gets up in the morning, and consequently, we tend to undermine our own ability to follow those conflict resolution and win models.
Yeah, really important point.
Yeah, well, I think Paul was getting at it and sort of thinking about, I'm sorry, Nelson is gone, but I understand, in terms of psychological, intellectual, moral, spiritual development. And those grow, if you will, and unfold in terms of increasing the possibilities for the kind of reasoning that Gray's been talking about, that we're trying to overcome the binary sorts of stuff. But that's hard, and that needs nurture in communities that want to move beyond just that. It's all about the group think. My group is over against your group. You know, Erickson said that's why the military wants young men, because they're easily persuadable to put their identity in terms of their group identity, and so on. And overcoming that one, which is a common way of people being oriented, then makes it difficult if those are the kind of people controlling your AI. And people lifted up the capitalist motive, the greed motive, and so on that comes. It's a great tool to extract more wealth from those that don't have those resources.
And if I could just tag on to that, I'm thinking of Adichie, the Nigerian woman's presentation of the inadequacy of the single story. There's always another narrative. And if I can push that towards historiography, Hayden Wright's work for the last 3 or 4 decades on meta history, you have to ask whose history is it, whose perspective, instead of a single objectivistic approach to interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think like Richard when it comes to technology, but I wanted to offer a little piece of hope, and in that the most intelligent person I've known in my life, he did his 5th grade homework in base 8 for the fun of it. When I saw him recently, he told me that he interviewed to become one of the IBM team members to do the work in quantum computing. And the person across the desk who was listening to him was Bülent Kurdi, who had been the AFS exchange student to my high school. So that they met when they were 16. And I know Chris Beavis is a basically good person. And I truly believe Bülent Kurdi is a basically good person. So I offer that we cannot see the disconnection or pretend there is a disconnection between the consciousness that we use to create our technologies and the consciousness that involves us with a God that we almost participate with consciously.
One of the values that I have by coming to these conferences is it does tend to draw me out of some of the dark places that I go. I wind up talking to people who are struggling and trying to find values because I'm very isolated. I don't teach at a Quaker school. I teach at a big state school, and there are very few students who have an activist or progressive mentality. It's far more conservative than what you're going to find in elite schools. My school is definitely not elite. And, just finding some kind of hope, that's a value that I get every once in a while when I attend these things. And I'm actually so glad it's on Zoom because there wouldn't have been any way I would have gotten here if I had to travel, right? My wife had minor surgery this week, so I'm here because of Zoom, and it's great.
Gray, speaking of quantum computing, have you or any of your students given any thought to how that would apply to the principles that you outlined here today?
I've given it a bunch of thought, and I have to confess, I'm pretty mystified still by quantum computing, right? It's really interesting, but I don't have any simple things to say with regard to that. I don't know, Phileas, do you have any thoughts about that?
Not immediately. I mean, so it's sort of one of the big advantages of quantum computing comes in just computing really, just parallel computing at a really, really massive scale that just isn't possible with binary computers. But it's really hard to, I mean, it's really hard to approach really what that would mean in terms of because in terms of things like artificial intelligence, because it's still such a recent development in terms of how, like, in terms of quantum computing becoming more, I mean, quantum supremacy was demonstrated only maybe like a year or two ago, I think, from a computing standpoint. So I think it's still really a bit too early to tell exactly how that will come out, because there are so few tools that exist yet to really explore quantum computing. And also, quantum computers aren't really accessible. They require so much. I mean, they require so much specialized equipment. They require really intense cooling equipment because they're doing this huge parallel processing at the same time for things. So I don't really have much to contribute about it either, unfortunately.
I do have one further thought about this, which is that I think how do I put this? I think that it's, the big breakthroughs in machine learning have happened in large part because of the increases in the power of the computers. So the basic ideas of machine learning have been around for quite a while, right? But it's only been possible to process, you know, hundreds of thousands and millions of cases and examples more recently. And so I think there's, for a lot of people in the AI community, they're just assuming that, well, if we get more powerful, maybe quantum computers can help us do this. If we get more power, then we'll be able to, you know, get closer to sort of human kinds of intelligence and so on. But I think actually that's in many ways a mistake. I think that that what's needed are software innovations, different principles of computing, programming, like what I'm proposing here with dialogical reasoning as a way of thinking about the structure of the programs. And you know, one of the striking things is that children can learn to distinguish, you know, zebras from horses in a dozen examples or so, right? And machines take, you know, thousands and hundreds of thousands of them, right? So children somehow are doing a kind of cognitive function that's different. And figuring that out may be the key to actually moving forward and not getting hyper faster machines. I want to thank you all very much. It's time to stop this session because George's is about to start. So, but thank you all very much. And I hope maybe to get a chance to talk to you all more in the future. Okay, take care. Bye-bye. Bye, thanks, Felius.